Political philosophy. Almost every account one reads of political philosophy in the 20th century analytic tradition, now including this one, begins by reporting the famous remark made in 1956 by Peter Lasset in the introduction to a collection of papers he edited entitled Philosophy, Politics, and Society, that political philosophy is dead. Writing 6 years later in the successor volume to that collection, Isaiah Berlin, although rejecting Lasset's view, nevertheless claimed that the 20th century had produced no commanding work of political philosophy. Yet in the same volume there appeared a reprint of John Rawls' essay, Justice as Fairness, indicating that proof would soon arrive that Berlin's claim was premature. For in the following decade, the century's greatest classics of analytical political philosophy appeared. Rawls' A Theory of Justice in 1971, and Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia in 1974. Lasset said that the grand tradition of English political thought from Hobbes to Bossuet might have been brought to an end by the horrors of the 20th century, whose wars and atrocities had made politics seem too serious a matter to be left to philosophers. This is an odd view, given that it was turmoil that had prompted Hobbes and Locke, and before them Machiavelli, to write about political ideas. Moreover, the 20th century's wars and atrocities had prompted Karl Popper to write his Open Society and Its Enemies in 1946, which he described as his contribution to the war effort, but it did not much engage the attention of philosophers. And even as Lasset offered his gloomy pronouncement, so Isaiah Berlin, John Rawls, and Michael Oakeshott were writing, and on the continent, Hannah Arendt, Louis Althusser, George Lukács, and members of the Frankfurt School were active but practically invisible to their Anglophone contemporaries. One reason offered for the temporary marginalization of political philosophy in the analytic tradition was the rise of political science, whereas political philosophy concerns itself with the fundamental concepts of politics: authority, justice, liberty, rights, equality, democracy, and totalitarianism, and analysis of particular political orientations such as socialism, fascism, conservatism, liberalism, and Marxism. Political science is about government, states, political parties, institutions, citizenship, systems of power, control, and policy, policing, and the distribution of economic and social resources. Political philosophy examines principles and justifications and is speculative, crucial, and evaluatory. Political science examines practices and structures, and it is descriptive and empirical. The thought is that positivistic turn in philosophy, with its respect for methods of science, made some find the empirical task of describing institutions and practices more congenial than the harder and messier task of seeking principles and justifications for them. But as events proved, political philosophy was not dead, and the contributions made especially by Rawls and Nozick are a permanent contribution to the grand tradition Lasset thought he was mourning. John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, was born in Baltimore, Maryland, where his father was a lawyer and his mother, Anna Abel Stump Rawls, was an activist for female suffrage. She and her fellow suffragists had seen the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution passed in August of 1920, 6 months before Rawls' birth, granting all American women the right to vote. As president of her local chapter of the League of Women Voters, she remained active in the campaign to get an Equal Rights Amendment granting women equality with men in all social and economic respects. At this time of writing, nearly a century later, the ERA has still not been passed. Her interests undoubtedly had an effect on Rawls' interests. There would seem no more natural a progression from her activism to the subject of Rawls' theorizing, which was motivated by a desire to formulate a genuinely practical political theory. In childhood, Rawls lost 2 of his 4 brothers to illnesses from which he had suffered and which he claimed they had caught from him. After graduating from Princeton University in 1943, he joined the Army and served in the Pacific as an infantryman, suffering significant trauma and losing his religious faith because of his experiences there. After the war, he returned to Princeton for his Ph.D. and then had a spell at Oxford on a Fulbright scholarship, attending discussions with Isaiah Berlin, Herbert Hart, and Stuart Hampshire. After a short time on the faculty at Cornell University, he went to Harvard and remained there for the rest of his career. Rawls opposed American military involvement in Vietnam. He was a reserved individual with a stutter who disliked public exposure, and therefore he did not become an overt campaigner. But his thinking about politics was motivated by a strong desire to find ways in which political conflict can be avoided or managed, in which reconciliation can be achieved when it occurs, and in which the best reasonably possible political order can be devised. These last remarks indicate Rawls' aim in offering a contribution to debate about essential concern for liberal democratic thinking, the apparent inconsistency between liberty and equality. Equality can be achieved only if liberty is restricted. Liberty results in inequalities because the differences between people in starting point, talent, energy, and luck quickly produce them. Isaiah Berlin, in line with his general view of value pluralism, held that liberty and equality are irredeemably in conflict. Rawls was more optimistic, however, believing that a fair society could accommodate citizens who were both individually free and in germane respects equal. His conception of reflective equilibrium has a role here. It is what is arrived at when deliberation about principles and values brings them into a more coherent relationship with each other. The first question Rawls addressed was one of method. How is one to approach the task of formulating a conception of justice that will be recognized as reasonably by any reflective citizen? His answer is to generalize the idea of a social contract as put forward by Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, by asking what kind of social-political arrangements people would choose to accept if, as it were, before being born, they could do so. Imagine them behind a veil of ignorance regarding what they will be, knowing nothing about their future, what social class they will occupy, how intelligent, gifted, or healthy they will be, what kind of society it is, or what they might come to have in the way of their own values, beliefs, and aims. They will know only that circumstances of justice apply and that the situation will be one of moderate scarcity of resources, so that the inhabitants' belief about what is morally and politically right will determine the distribution of those resources. However, the denizens of the original position behind their veil of ignorance will not be entirely bereft or of help in choosing what kind of society it should be, for they will have a thin history of the good that tells them they would rather have more than less of a certain range of primary social goods, these being things which it is supposed a rational man wants whatever else he wants, namely rights and liberties, opportunities and powers, income and wealth, and a sense of one's own worth. Rawls argues that people behind the veil of ignorance would apply what is known as a maxim strategy for choosing what kind of society it should be, this being a strategy in game theory that makes the most of the least that can be reliably anticipated in a given situation. On this basis, he says, people in the original position would choose to see the following two principles of justice in operation. First, that each member of society would have an equal right to the greatest degree of basic liberty compatible with everyone else's basic liberty. And second, that inequalities in society should be so arranged that they provide the greatest benefit possible to the least advantaged, and should not prevent offices and positions from being open to everyone under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The first principle has priority over the second, and fair equality of opportunity has priority over ensuring that the least advantaged have the best deal possible for them in their circumstances. Rawls' governing idea that justice is fairness postulates a society where institutions and structures have a basic structure that ensures the distribution of social goods and burdens to which reflective citizens will consent and in which they will cooperate. It is an assumption of his view that the society is reasonably well favored, that is not racked by war or suffering from drought and famine. He also assumes that arbitrary advantages, being born with talents or into a rich family, do not merit a larger share of the distribution. The distribution has to be equal unless everyone would benefit from an unequal distribution. A society would not be just if it ignored future generations and consumed all its resources so that nothing is left for those who come afterwards. Accordingly, in the original position, a choice would be made to agree to a just savings principle, settling what each generation must conserve for the use of future generations. The idea of the original position allows Rawls to work through a set of steps that its occupants would take as they learned increasingly more about the society they are to occupy, graduating from the most general principles to more specific ways of ensuring the maximum compatibility of liberty and equality, and in particular, whether the society they envision would be enduring. The aim is to arrive at a stable conception of justice that will command assent because it is perspicuous to our reason and congruent with our good. So a comparison would be offered between the principles identified and utilitarian principles aimed either at maximizing benefit for the largest number, which would at least mean ignoring a requirement to do the best one can for the worst off, or achieving the highest average utility for all, which would keep in play a degree of consideration for the least advantaged, but would not achieve the best possible distribution of goods and burdens. Rawls claims that citizens would prefer the veil of ignorance principles to utilitarian ones because the maximum rule they rest on is more productive of fairness than our other systems of distribution. Rawls' work generated an enormous response of both elaboration and criticism. Political philosophy since 1971 might be said to be shaped almost exclusively by it. Every step in his argument lies at the center of a debate. The idea of the original position, the treatment of the vexed question of differences in natural abilities and starting points as barriers to equality, the individual principles of justice themselves, and more. To focus on just one, but very important, target of the criticisms, consider the point about the thin conception of the good, which Rawls had to equip the denizens of the original position. The veil of ignorance is designed to constrain the reasoning of the denizens to impartial considerations, which would not be possible if they knew about, say, their race, sex, religious affiliation in advance. The conception that they have of the good has to be thin, because if it were thickened by being some particular theory of the good, Christian, Muslim, or humanist say, then the outcome would be biased in that direction, not automatically commanding the assent and respect of all. But what is the guarantee that the thin conception will achieve this latter desideratum? Recall that it consists in the view that having more rather than less of a certain range of primary social goods is desirable, these things being things which it is supposed a rational man wants whatever else he wants, namely rights and liberties, opportunities and powers, income and wealth, and a sense of one's own worth. Is that what every rational man wants? These are goods on which a high value is placed in the outlook of liberal individualism, certainly. But to credit the denizens of the original position with this conception of the good is to beg the question against the kind of society they would wish to live in. They are being given precisely the values that would guarantee that choice. This criticism adds to other aims, or others aimed at the concept of an original position. A powerful one is that occupants of the original position are envisaged not merely as equal, but in effect as identical. They are all in exactly the same boat, with the same information or lack of it, the same thin theory of the good, and the same reasoning powers. As one critic, Brian Barry, put it, quote, faced with identical information and reasoning in an identical fashion, they arrive at identical conclusions. We might as well talk of computers having the same program and fed the same input reaching an agreement, end quote. How can a form of social contract emerge from a situation in which there is nothing to bargain about? The deriving consideration would be to protect oneself as much as possible in case one finds oneself at the bottom of the heap in the coming society. Indeed, this suggests at the bottom of the heap in the coming society the reason for the asymmetry in Rawls' view, that whereas arbitrary advantages provide no justification for proportionate but therefore unequal shares in any distribution, arbitrary disadvantages do. And this, though morally unimpeachable, is not by itself obviously a principle of justice, though it might be one of fairness. Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia of 1974 stands as a point on a political spectrum rather far from the point at which Rawls stands. Whereas Rawls, a theory of justice, placed him firmly in the liberal tradition, Nozick describes the viewpoint of his book as libertarian, a viewpoint on the further right of politics which Nozick himself acknowledges is apparently callous, without justifying the apparently. He says that he arrived at this view having traveled to it from a more liberal standpoint as a result of considering the arguments for it. This, at least, is a hopeful claim, seeming to rebuke Hume's view that it is emotion only and never reason that can motivate our choices. But there is a special interest in Nozick's remark to this effect, given that in his student days he was a member of the Socialist Party, and in a latter work, The Examined Life, in 1989, he indicated areas where the argument of anarchy went wrong, and took an unduly narrow view because it left out questions of social solidarity and humane concern for others. These temperings of the view can be borne in mind, though Nozick self-identified as a libertarian to the end. Robert Nozick, born in 1938 and died in 2002, was born in New York to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. He attended schools near his home in Brooklyn and Columbia University for his undergraduate studies. He took his PhD at Princeton and spent a year at Oxford afterward on a Fulbright scholarship. By his own account, it was at Princeton that he first encountered arguments in defense of capitalism in the writings of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and in conversation with economist Murray Rothbard. He began by rejecting the arguments, later coming to think, as he said in a Forbes magazine interview in 1975, quote, well, yes, the arguments are right, Capitalism is the best system, but only bad people would think so. Then at some point my mind and heart were in unison, end quote. A feature of this remark and what it portends prompts a question. Capitalism and libertarianism are not necessarily linked. There are forms of capitalism which seek to temper the wind to the shorn lamb with welfare provisions and redistribution's state intervention. Welfare capitalism, for example. There are forms that mix state and private participation in the economy. Why go all the way from accepting arguments for capitalism to libertarianism, which is a particular view about the relationship between the state and the individual? One of Nozick's main motives for setting out his libertarian views was to combat the ideas of Rawls, by then his colleague at Harvard. The burden of his argument is set out with clarity and succinctness in the preface to Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It is that individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. The rights are so strong that they force consideration of the limits of state power relative to individuals. Nozick accordingly focuses on the question of the legitimacy of the state. His conclusion is also clearly and succinctly stated in the preface. It is that, quote, a minimal state limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, and so on, is justified. That any more extensive state will violate persons' rights not to be forced to do certain things and is unjustified, and that the minimal state is inspiring as well as right. This echoes the classic 19th century night watchman theory of the state, and he wittily summed up one aspect of it by saying that no government has the right to forbid capitalistic acts between consenting adults. Two implications of these points, Nozick says, are that the state may not use its coercive apparatus for the purpose of getting some citizens to aid others, or in order to prohibit activities to people for their own good or protection. The libertarian aspect of the view lies in these implications. Presumably, the idea of taxing individuals enough to provide welfare is an example of the state coercing its citizens to aid others. Certainly, laws prohibiting recreational drugs and requiring the wearing of motorbike helmets are examples of the state legislating for people's good on their behalf. The strong rights, Nozick claims, individuals have are those of the state of nature, which much as envisioned by John Locke. They predate any social contract or the existence of any institutions and are inviolable, so that the advent of a contract or of institutions cannot abrogate or even limit them. He acknowledges that he offers no grounds for saying what he does about these rights, although his argument against the idea that individuals can bear some cost in the interest of an overall social good might go some way to providing a justification. For there he says that there is no social entity or society with interest which would be served by individuals bearing costs. There are only those individuals. To ask an individual to bear a cost on behalf of society is nothing more than to use that individual to benefit other individuals. The invocations of society are a fig leaf for that. There, quote, there is no justified sacrifice of some of us for others, end quote. Individuals are separate persons seeking their own good in their own way, says Nozick, and he sees their separateness as part of the reason for the inviolability of their fundamental rights. They are, in Kant's terminology, ends in themselves. And it is presumably also because Nozick is sympathetic to a view he cites from earlier political theorists about people, quote, having property in themselves and their labor, end quote. The minimalist state Nozick sees as very like a business corporation, not least in that it does not finance itself by imposing taxes. This prompts the interesting thought that a state might finance itself by selling its services to its citizens. And this indeed is one way of interpreting Nozick's invisible hand. Similar to Edmund Burke, a suggestion about how the state comes into existence in the first place. People in the state of nature will band together to protect themselves from depredations, and there will eventually emerge a dominant protection agency, the state, from this self-organization process. This, however, poses a problem that Nozick has to meet from, as it were, the other side of this case, the anarchist challenge. Why should there be any form of state at all? Anarchists claim that a state uses its monopoly of coercive power to punish those who challenge its monopoly. When the state uses its coercive power to oblige some to help others, as it does, for example, through taxation, it thereby violates their fundamental rights. Nozick's response is to say that the justification for the state's existence, which is the protection it gives its citizens against depredations, of itself draws the limits of its powers. One might say that his utopia, which he claims is inspirational as well as legitimate, in ensuring peace by protecting those inviolable rights. Ipso facto implies protection from the violation of them by itself. One standard criticism of minimalist theories of the state is that they make no provision for redistributive justice. Nozick attacks the implicit idea that there is an agency that collects and then equitably hands out shares of social and economic goods. Instead, he proposes what he calls justice in holdings. Consider Locke's idea of coming to own something, not owned by anyone else, by mixing one's labor with it. This is a just acquisition. Coming to own something by a just transfer, buying something from someone who legitimately owns that thing and who sells it voluntarily, is another form. A third form is by rectification of past injustices in either acquisition or transfer, as with having stolen works of art or other property restored to their rightful owners, as with victims of Nazism. Coming to own something by any of these three means gives one entitlement to it. If anyone has what he is entitled to, the distribution of holdings in the state is just. Nozick uses the example of a basketball player who becomes vastly richer than anyone else because everyone else frequently and voluntarily pays small sums to see him play. Imagine that at the start of his career, everyone has exactly the same amount of money. Presumably that is a just arrangement. Over the course of his career, the basketball player becomes vastly richer, quite legitimately. Has the distribution become unjust? Clearly not, Nozick says. What Nozick leaves out of his picture is the case of acquisition of holdings by inheritance. Is that just or unjust? There is the question of what difference is made by differentials in holdings, the advantages they provide in healthcare, education, and opportunities. And might not natural advantages such as intelligence, good looks, athletic skill be regarded as a kind of holdings, violating any idea of entitlement, and what follows from it? Nozick's defense of a libertarian view gave much comfort to political conservatives and is what he is best known for. But he also made major contributions in theory of knowledge and ethics, principally set out in his other major book, Philosophical Explanations, written in 1981. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on Robert Nozick and Rawls. Thank you.